Hello class, this is lesson 7 of the course. This week the focus is on budgeting. This is the last lesson before exam 2, so later on this week I will post some information about the second exam, but just know this is, the last major lesson before we get to exam 2. And the focus, as I said, is on budgeting. Budgeting is something that all sectors, private sector, public sector, nonprofit, they all engage in some form of budgeting. Budgeting, the basic idea, you're thinking, how they handle their money. Well, it can be more difficult in the public sector. We are studying public administration, and so what makes budgeting distinct in the public sector and with public administration is that while a private business can write their own budget, in the public sector, budgets are essentially, drafted, they're written, they're finalized by your legislative entity. It is a very political process. And depending on, overall economy and the political feel at the times, whether, it's to provide, more support for certain policies over others, it can impact the budget. And so even though, we'll look at budget process briefly and, in a few minutes in this video and in the lesson, it's something that, an agency, a manager, can make a request for a budget, but it doesn't mean they're going to get that. There's still someone who essentially oversees what they receive and how they spend it. And so as it says in the beginning of the lesson, a basic definition provided by Stillman of a budget is a legal contract that provides a vehicle for fiscal controls over subordinate units of government by the politically elected representatives of the people. So, basic idea, your budget is your fiscal document, your financial document. It shows, and depending on the style of budget that you're using, it shows the amounts of money you receive, what's spent, your revenues, your expenditures, assets, all of these different components will make up the actual budget. So it's got your financial, essentially, information. It's also a legal contract in the sense that you can see who is receiving what funds, how it's essentially supposed to be spent, and it provides us a form of accountability so that citizens can, look at an agency's budget and they can determine, well, it's kind of a, what did they do with all this money? They were given these resources. Who can I hold accountable for the use of, this particular set of resources? And as it says in the definition that I've already mentioned, it is very political. Because your political representatives are the ones who draft and finalize the budget and make these determinations, what an agency does or does not receive may depend on kind of the politics of the time rather than how efficient or effective that agency was. And so it can be a little bit trickier to handle a budget in the public sector. Now, the next part of the lesson kind of overviews just three types of budgeting. There are a lot of different types of budgeting, and you can find different examples. There's an entire course on budgeting financial management issues in public administration, within our program. But the three that I mentioned in the lesson, first is one of the most well-known basic forms of budgeting. It's still used quite a bit in local government level, and it's the one people can connect with more easily because, logically, it can just make a lot of sense. As it says, it's the line item budget. It's like putting lines in a ledger book. So if you think about your own personal budget, maybe you have, rent, electric, car payment, phone bill, these different categories line by line. And you see it and it's like, oh, well, I know how much, I have to spend for this, and this is, it's very clear as to what the categories are. It can help with things like being able to control, where the money goes and how much goes into it. However, it doesn't really show you if it was an efficient use of the money that you received. And so over time, we had the development of other forms of budgeting. So the next one I mentioned in the lesson is performance budgeting. Now this one kind of adds on that idea of showing, or of helping you show whether or not money was spent efficiently, because you can see whether performance goals were met. The idea is that, say, rather than having, a line-by-line system, you compile into a category, maybe by function or specialization, something like that, the different budget items, and that way you can kind of determine, whether or not they were efficient in, say it's trash collection, whether they were efficient in, collecting trash to these different locations, rather than just having, an item that says gas for, garbage trucks and those different individual items. You can see a broader performance. But again, it's not, none of these forms of budgeting are perfect, and you often get a combination of them. So you might have a combination of line item and performance budgeting that's still used, in a lot of places. But they have developed other forms of budgeting, and some are more or less popular than others. And so one of the other ones I have listed is zero-based budgeting. You've heard the term earlier in the semester, the idea of incrementalism. We look at it in regard to decision making quite a bit with public policy, but it's a big issue with budgeting. So normally, you have a budget, and even if it's a line item budget or a performance based budget, next year comes around and say you're like, oh, inflation's gone up, or cost of living, whatever it is, so you incrementally increase or potentially decrease that particular budget category. You simply say, okay, this is what I spent my money on last month. I'm going to need to spend it again this month. Just go up or down a little bit. So these incremental changes, you're not going back and looking at whether, every month, every time you pay it, you don't go back and look, oh, do I really need home internet service? Or, oh, do I really need, a car payment? You don't re-examine each of your own categories. Well, often in, with public sector organizations, they don't reevaluate those every category each budget cycle as well. Zero-based budgeting allows you to do that. It kind of it rejects this idea of incremental changes and re-examines kind of the purpose and point of each of those different categories. And so it can be really helpful in looking at the effectiveness of of different programs, and so it builds that into the budgeting process. However, it's very timely to do and can be costly to try and implement zero-based budgeting. And so, we still tend to rely on incremental forms of budgeting rather than, going back and looking, the whole process over again. But there are these different options in budgeting. And again, within a full budgeting course, you'll get quite a bit more detail on, the different uses of these different forms of budgeting. But it's important to know that these different forms do exist, and you might be in an agency or organization that chooses different types and forms of budgeting, so that when you go to look at a budget document, say you want to look at, how effective your organization has been, sometimes looking at the budget will be useful in making that determination. You may get more or less information about an organization, about certain policies, and whether or not they've been successful by looking at a budget document. Okay, next in the lesson, I kind of talk about some of the process of budgeting. So first is federal budgeting. Really what we focus on here is fiscal policy. And so fiscal policy is basically when government taxes and spends. It's, when we think of the budget document, economic policy can be a little bit different. It involves different forms of monetary policy and interest rates and things like that. Whereas generally what we look at with budgeting are your revenues coming in, so the taxes you bring in, and then how the money is spent. Different policies and programs that are put into place. And so I go through kind of the process. in the lesson and give a few of the key terms. Now, with the budget at the federal level, generally the budget is going to address your, it's got all the different components, but the federal budget will make changes to discretionary spending. So things like military spending, social welfare spending, things like that, or not all social welfare, but some programs, you will get discretionary, they're discretionary spending. So Congress can make changes. However, there are mandatory spending items and entitlement programs that are automatic. Essentially, they're automatic payments, is an easy way to put it, for the federal budget. So these are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are entitlement programs that, in order to change the amounts, there has to be a change in the laws that deal with those particular programs. Mandatory spending can be something like interest on our debt. The country has to pay interest on its debt. It's a mandatory spending item. And so government chooses these other categories, these discretionary, to really focus on when they write their, the budget for the fiscal year. And so, again, you can look at kind of the process in a little more detail and some of the main terms within the lesson. The revenue stream, so basically, how does government get its money? Federal, generally through taxes. Federal government, the personal income tax is your main source of revenue. Some states will have a state income tax. Texas does not. It doesn't have that individual income tax separate from the federal government. Federal government does. That's where most funds come from. It is considered a progressive tax, meaning as your income goes up, the amount increases. So if you look at like the chart, the lower percentage of your income is taxed at a lower rate. The higher, the higher up your income goes, as it gets into certain categories, you're taxed at a higher rate. There are also, corporate income taxes and different things like that, that the federal government uses. The states, or most states, tend to rely on things like sales taxes. Again, some states do have a state income tax. In Texas, the main revenue source is the sales tax. It is considered regressive, meaning that essentially as your income decreases, the percentage increases. So the idea is that someone with a lower income is spending a larger portion of that income on, the same item as somebody with a higher incomes, because they have more money. It's kind of the same sales tax price, and so a lower percentage of their income is being spent on it. There are examples, again, within the lesson. The local governments and local government in Texas, their biggest revenue source is the property tax. One of the big areas that local government tends to pay for are your elementary and secondary schools, and those are largely, again, funded through property taxes. There are political issues that come into play, as I've said before, with budgeting, and so something, for example, like your elementary, secondary education, there have been a lot of legal and political questions about the use of property taxes to fund local schools, because you have such vastly different property, in different areas. You'll have a wealthy district versus a poor district, and so it can cause differences in education. And so you often see politics come into play when they try to put into place different programs and alter the way money is shifted because of the political ramifications of, say, having really wealthy versus, again, really poor school districts. So that's an example of how politics often comes into play with budgeting. And so the budget, might end up shifting and be different as a result of what's going on politically. Within the lesson, after I go through the federal process and revenue concepts, there is just some information on the Texas budget process, so you can see kind of some of the big issues with the state. Unlike the federal government, a lot of states don't allow you to run any sort of deficit. They have to have a balanced budget. In Texas, there has to be a balanced budget. And so you can't have the same sort of deficit spending, which allows federal government to do different sorts of things than a state can do. The Texas budget is also done every other year. It's when the legislature is in session, and so it's a 2-year budget. Some people like the idea that the Texas, legislature meets every other year. However, there have been some arguments about, this forecasting of a 2-year budget, that it should be a yearly budget, which affects, the whole legislative process. So again, politics comes into play with determining, who gets to say, kind of predict what the revenues will be for the next 2 years and how that money will be spent. Okay. And then I have a diagram of the Texas budget cycle, and those are the main concepts in the lesson. Again, budgeting can be a pretty complex, we don't go through every single step within the lesson of budgeting. There are entire courses on it, but it is a really important item for a public manager to kind of understand. You need to know how you're getting your revenues, what can impact those revenues, how they should be spent, how you determine who's accountable for them. And so kind of budgeting is a pretty complex but really important area of public administration and management. Now, your assignments for this week, the discussion has you looking more at some of the political issues and this idea of battles within the budget for the discussion. And then your short answer has you define 4 terms, which you can find in your book. Use complete sentences. You can quote as long as you use quotation marks and cite correctly. So if you do, use a direct quote, make sure it's cited, all that. So, and the terms are executive budget, legislative budget, operating budget, and capital budget. Okay, so those are your assignments for this week. It is chapter 9 in the book. If you have any questions, just let me know. And again, I will post some information about exam 2 a little bit later in the week.